Stories from the pages of time. Stories of triumph and tragedy, adventure and achievement, as we go in search of history. What is science? What is fiction? And what happens when the two worlds collide? History is made.
Impossible, unbelievable, fantastic, but I tell you it could happen.
Rockets, cloning, robots, moonwalks, atom bombs, all started as futuristic visions of prophetic science fiction writers. And now, they're reality.
Science fiction writers are predictors of the future.
We discover how our future was taken straight from the pages of far-out books and magazines as we go in search of history for the truth about science fiction. Science fiction, the genre that ponders, what if? What if man lived on the moon? What if electricity could bring a man to life? What if robots ruled the world? Science fiction as we know it emerged in the 1700s. It is an imaginative form of literature that takes root in science and grows from there, introducing new worlds and new times.
Science fiction is the literature that deals with the impact of scientific and technological advancement on human beings.
Like most human beings, science fiction writers wonder about the future. These modern-day seers use science to make their imaginary worlds believable. Their tools, the information available at the time. They see the shape of things to come.
Science fiction writers are predictors of the future, but it's a hobby. We don't get extra money for guessing right.
I think people can relate to this kind of literature because they want to imagine themselves as the forerunners of the future. They want to imagine themselves being on the threshold of what is to come.
An interesting way to read history is through the writings of people who envisioned it before it happened. Around the Moon, a story by Jules Verne written in 1870, predicted weightlessness when Verne wrote,
"The three adventurous companions were surprised and stupefied despite their scientific reasonings. Their feet no longer clung to the floor of the projectile."
And this almost 100 years before man ever flew in space and experienced it. Before flying by airplane had ever been achieved, H.G. Wells wrote When the Sleeper Wakes in 1899, describing battles between aircraft squadrons in this passage.
He looked up with a start and saw the huge wings of the flying machine gliding slowly and noiselessly overhead.
Wells even wrote about the airports the fleets of planes came from. The list of early visions becoming fact is astonishing. The Angel of the Revolution by George Griffith in 1893 described aerial battleships. In 1904, Rudyard Kipling's With the Night Mail predicted airmail. Edwin Balmer's 1910 Achievements of Luther Trant detailed the lie detector. These glimpses of science fiction becoming reality are often the jumping-off point for many scientists. They credit the fiction in developing the real world of today and tomorrow. H.G. Wells and Jules Verne are the two men most often named the fathers of science fiction.
Verne made a very interesting comment at the end of his life, comparing the two, because many people put them together and they call Verne the French H.G. Wells. And he said, no, he said, Wells invents, and I do not invent.
Jules Verne's best-known stories are 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Around the World in 80 Days, and Journey to the Center of the Earth. He originally wanted to be a playwright, but couldn't make money at it. So Verne tried his hand at adventure stories for young readers in order to make ends meet.
He was an incredibly curious man. I don't think he started out to be a writer of scientific popularization, but when it came along, he threw himself in wholeheartedly.
Verne's first scientific romance, as they were called, 5 Weeks in a Balloon, is an adventure story about young people taking off into the unknown. In addition to the rip-roaring action, he included technical details about balloons and how they fly. After publication in 1861, Verne predicted the development of aviation with an astoundingly accurate vision of modern airplanes when he said in a speech,
How can a balloon be made to face currents running at 6, 7, or 8 meters to a second? It is a mere dream, though I believe that if the question is ever to be solved, it will be a machine which will be heavier than the air, following the principle of the bird, which can fly, though it is heavier than the air which it displaces.
Science fiction is very important in stimulating scientific research and discovery. Verne, I'm sure, inspired any number of young budding scientists to actually embark upon a scientific career. The spirit of Jules Verne was picked up by Hugo Gernsback.
Hugo Gernsback is credited with popularizing science fiction and bringing it into the mainstream. Born in Luxembourg in 1884, he brought awe-inspiring new worlds into focus in his novels and magazines.
Hugo Gernsback was an electrical experimenter. He was a man fascinated by radio, by aviation, by all of these wonderful new things that were happening at the millennium.
In 1911, at the age of 27, Gernsback wrote Ralph 124C41+, a romance set in 2660. His list of successful scientific prophecies from the book is nothing short of remarkable. Gernsback imagined a world with jukeboxes, skywriting, television, vending machines, and night baseball. He wrote,
During the daytime, with the sun shining, there is always one team which has an advantage over the other, on account of the light being in their eyes. In the evening, however, with a powerful stationary light overhead, each team has the same conditions.
The first night game in baseball was not played until 27 years later. Ralph 124C41+ was extremely popular at the time it was published, but not recognized for its remarkable predictions until they became realities.
The response to this story was greater than anything he had ever published in any of his magazines. And he thought, gee, this is kind of interesting. People are really responding to fictionalized science stories. And so he coined the phrase, the word, scientifiction.
Gernsback felt that his scientifiction stories should both entertain and educate.
His idea was there should be stories written that are lessons, teaching lessons. And that's what he was doing.
Amazing Stories, the first English-language science fiction magazine, was Hugo's vehicle for getting his message to the masses. Amazing Stories debuted in 1926, selling an astonishing 100,000 copies in the first month. The magazine boasted, extravagant fiction today, cold fact tomorrow. Gernsback's hype promised that even the most outrageous claims could come true.
He spoke of inventions of the past that people had laughed. They'd said, you know, there'll never be airplanes and there'll never be this and that and the other thing, and that all these had come true.
The magazine showcased up-and-coming writers as well as renowned authors of the past.
He was careful to include reprinted stories by authors like H.G. Wells, Jules Verne, and even Edgar Allan Poe, because he knew these were writers that were highly respected at that point in time.
Amazing Stories became a staple of the scientific community. Other magazines were quick to catch on to the popularity of science fiction, and the genre grew into its own over the years. a tight-knit community of readers, publishers, illustrators, and writers was formed. Why? Because the genre made it okay to stretch the imagination and ponder, what if? Imagine a world where machines walked, where they talked,
I can perform 36 separate and distinct acts.
and where they could think on their own. Introducing the robot.
But he's a robot. Without you, what could he do?
There's no limit to what he could do. He could destroy the Earth.
Early stories about robots and androids grew out of the Industrial Revolution and fears that technology was getting out of control. People were being replaced by machines and felt that they were losing their place in their own world.
What are robots made for?
For work, Miss Glory. One robot can replace 2.5 workmen. The human machine, Miss Glory, was terribly imperfect. It had to be removed sooner or later.
These prophetic words come from Karl Čapek's Rossum's Universal Robots, or RUR. The play, written in 1921, is about soulless, manufactured servants who revolt and kill every human in the world. The word robot, Czechoslovakian for work, was introduced in this play.
There is no escape from me.
Inspired by science fiction, inventors dreamed of robots that would assist in the home.
Yes, ma'am. Rolo, get.
Robots would, however, assume much more practical jobs in the real world. A robot revolution spreading industry by industry. Science fiction writers were also the first to embrace the possibility of combining humans and machines. Enter the cyborg. Short for cybernetic organism, the cyborg first appeared in fiction in 1950 in Raymond F. Jones's novel, The Cybernetic Brains. The story envisions human brains implanted into machines and used for their memory. Jones wrote,
Do you understand what that means? 2 million men and women living, thinking, tortured by despair, sentenced to an eternal slavery in the hearts of our machines.
Science fiction writers have spoken many times of the idea of joining humans and machines as though these are two separate entities. And it has been rather grotesque as it's portrayed in fiction, because you can't really imagine how these two elements could be joined. If you're going to join gears and mechanical elements to flesh, it has to be grotesque.
Yet science has replaced human appendages and organs with electronic prosthetics. There are pacemakers for weak hearts and cochlear implants to help the hearing impaired. A bionic hand wired to real muscles copies the movements of the human hand much better than a mechanical substitute. Other kinds of medical research and ethics have been a focus of sci-fi ever since Mary Shelley's Frankenstein was published in 1818. Dr. Victor Frankenstein himself wondered about creating his creature. The doctor's thoughts, as Shelley wrote.
Although I possessed the capacity of bestowing animation, I doubted at first whether I should attempt the creation of a being like myself. But I doubted not that I should ultimately succeed.
Even though Shelley had no medical background, she still managed to intuit the role of electricity in the body. Today, the technology is used to restart hearts and save lives. In the 1991 movie Body Parts, an arm is grafted onto the body of a psychologist. In 1998, this fiction became a reality when a team of doctors took part in a groundbreaking hand and forearm transplant.
A company has come to the Caribbean to film a classic tale of imagination, one in which conjecture comes frighteningly close to reality.
Abuses of medicine have also been a concern brought up by science fiction writers.
This is human. This is man. This is law. His law!
When The Island of Dr. Moreau by H.G. Wells was published in 1896, it was met with public outrage. The story was graphic and gruesome.
You are an animal.
Jungle animals being surgically transformed into human beings in the House of Pain, the laboratory of Dr. Moreau. The narrator, trapped on the island, says,
"The creatures I had seen were not men, had never been men. They were animals, humanized animals, triumphs of vivisection."
The Island of Dr. Moreau is very much steeped in contemporary ideas about vivisection and the possibility of uplifting other species to bringing them more immediately into the human realm.
By the end of the story, the patients revert to their animal states and destroy Moreau and his island.
He's not a villain. He's not some evil scientist that's just out there carving up animals for sadism's sake. He is really trying to do something scientifically noble, and yet it's monstrous.
Ironically, medical science has reversed the direction of Dr. Moreau's work. The new science of xenotransplantation uses animal organs like baboon hearts and pig livers for transplants in order to help humans live healthier, better lives. Since the discovery of DNA, another medical concern emerged in science fiction: cloning. These stories became very popular in the 1970s. Books like Richard Cowper's 1972 Clone and Kate Wilhelm's 1976 Where Late the Sweet Bird Sang led the charge. Also in 1976, Ira Levin's immensely popular The Boys from Brazil explores a plot to clone Adolf Hitler.
He's alive. This album is full of pictures of him, exact genetic duplicates. They're pure Hitler, bred entirely from his cells.
The book took on new meaning in 1997 when a Scottish sheep named Dolly was the first animal to be successfully cloned.
Cloning is really just the production of a genetically identical individual to an individual that already exists. And this is what was done in the Dolly experiments, where a nucleus was transferred from an adult to produce an identical fetus, an identical infant.
With the technology already in place, many believe it is only a matter of time before human cloning is a common practice. The terrors of war are foreshadowed in science fiction. H.G. Wells led the charge.
He had this sense of apocalyptic doom.
Warfare science fiction style. The battlefields are dangerous. The landscapes alien. There are planet smashers and doomsday weaponry. These popular themes in sci-fi are often no comparison to the real horrors of war. In 1945, the atomic bomb ended the most destructive war in history. But long before the devastation at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, atomic power was the stuff of literary nightmares.
The bomb was absolutely unapproachable and uncontrollable until its forces were nearly exhausted, and from the crater that burst open above it, puffs of heavy, incandescent vapor were flung high and far.
These prophetic words come from the 1913 story, The World Set Free by H.G. Wells. It was in this book that he coined the term atomic bomb. Best known for his novels The Time Machine and The War of the Worlds, Wells was an Englishman, an author, a journalist, sociologist, historian, and a scientist.
He was a student of Huxley, the biologist, studied at the University of London. He came from a lower middle class family. He had to really scrape and grub to get where he was.
Obsessed by war, Wells was torn between two visions, salvation and destruction. Wells could not ignore the signs of impending conflict in the world. Governments were concentrating on developing bigger and more powerful weapons, so it was easy for Wells to extrapolate and create his fictional devices.
A couple of his stories in the first decade of the 20th century foresaw the possibility of things like tank warfare, all-out air warfare. His story, War in the Air, predicts an all-out war that will be realized with the First World War, and even more with the Second. He had this sense of apocalyptic doom, if you will, that he grappled with all his life. Later he was trying to find solutions for this, but he had no illusions about the nature of human beings and their capacity to destroy each other.
Haunted by visions of global upheaval, Wells set out to create his masterpiece, The War of the Worlds, in 1898. Earth was under attack by Martians, armed with extremely advanced weapons, including the devastating heat ray, an early fictional version of a real-life laser. Wells described the weapon when he wrote,
"It was sweeping round swiftly and steadily, this flaming death, this invisible, inevitable sword of heat."
In 1903, Wells's story, The Land Ironclad, spoke of large metal tanks. Actual tanks appeared in 1916 in the Battle of Flers-Courcelette in France.
Wells actually engaged in a patent suit, you see, to somehow cash in on this, to claim that he was the inventor of the tank. I mean, this is just a sidelight, but that gives you some sense of what the man was.
Wells was also apprehensive about the development of the airplane. In several stories, including The War in the Air, The World Set Free, and The Shape of Things to Come, he foresaw airplanes dropping bombs on an unsuspecting and unprotected population. Wells' vision came to the silver screen in 1936 when Things to Come was released.
One of the opening scenes involves people in England. They're living in any town, England, and they look up in the sky and there's fleets of bombers flying over the English Channel coming to bomb them. When the English audience saw that, they laughed. They thought it was preposterous, this idea of an aerial invasion, especially with thousands of airplanes. The Battle of Britain was 2 years away at that point.
Aside from war, Things to Come also featured remarkable advances in communication technologies.
What is this progress? What is the good of all this progress onward and onward?
The man in the future had a little gadget, and he spoke into it and talked to somebody else who was wearing it. And audiences in 1936 laughed at that.
Is Morris Parsworthy there? He's on his way. Good.
Wells' vision of a watch telephone was not far from the truth. In 1979, the cellular telephone was introduced, and his concept of personal wireless communication was a reality. But Wells wasn't the only science fiction writer to predict the global village in which we now live. a world of instant access to information and communication made possible, at least in part, by satellites. The communication satellite was first forecast by science fiction author Arthur C. Clarke. Best known for his novel 2001: A Space Odyssey, Clarke explored the idea of using a communications satellite in a 1945 scientific paper titled Extraterrestrial Relays. Clarke detailed how a satellite could orbit apparently motionless above the equator and serve as a relay station. It took almost 20 years for his prediction to become fact. Clarke's vision is now known as the geosynchronous satellite and is indispensable in modern communications. Clarke revisited the concept in his 1957 story, Special Delivery.
Now, he didn't patent the idea. People asked him, why didn't you patent it? Well, he said later, if he had patented it, it wouldn't have mattered. The patent would have run out before anyone could have flown a communication satellite. And in any case, the patent office would not have taken it seriously, would not have given him the patent.
Flight controllers, go for landing. Retro. Go. FIDO. Go. Guidance. Go. Control. Go. Telcom. Go. GNC. Go. ECOM. Go. Surgeon. Go. Capcom, we're go for landing. Eagle, Houston, you're go for landing, over. The Eagle has landed.
July 20th, 1969. Neil Armstrong takes one small step onto the surface of the moon and one giant leap for mankind.
The whole idea of space travel, and then space travel using technological means, came out of arts and literature, not engineering, not science at all. The founding fathers of modern rocketry and astronautics all credited Jules Verne with having started their ideas for even thinking about space travel.
Verne's From the Earth to the Moon was published in France in September 1865. The story was one of the first that described a moon flight using a space vehicle.
It is perhaps reserved for us to become the Columbuses of this unknown world.
Readers saw Verne's tale of a spacecraft piloted by Americans as pure fantasy when he wrote,
I find that a projectile endowed with an initial velocity of 12,000 yards per second and aim at the moon must necessarily reach it.
The truth is, Verne predicted more than even he could have imagined.
His rocket takes off from a place very close to where Cape Canaveral is today on the tip of Florida.
The Frenchman Verne set the liftoff in the U.S. because he admired the American entrepreneurial spirit. Verne's method of propulsion? A cannon. Absurd by today's standards, it was nonetheless a natural hypothesis for his time.
Jules Verne's contribution to this, for example, was to show that it might be possible to launch a projectile from the Earth to the Moon using nothing but available technology.
The science is totally wrong, and yet at that time ballistics was the major science, and people were speculating on the possibility of giant cannons and things like this.
In 1929, German film director Fritz Lang's The Woman in the Moon captivated audiences and demonstrated a more accurately modern approach.
It was a major motion picture, big film. A lot of money went into it. They put a lot of effort into trying to get it right. The thing about that movie that was so interesting is that they invented something in that movie that we use today in every rocket launching, the countdown.
Three, go.
It was the first countdown for a rocket launch in history anybody knows of. Even Jules Verne missed that. He counts up. It was strictly done for dramatic reasons. So Lang said he thought it would increase the suspense. They counted down to the 0. And that was the only reason he did it.
The spacecraft was designed by real rocket scientists Hermann Oberth and Willy Ley. While Ley later defected to America, Oberth developed the V-2 rocket program for the Nazis. Their work on the film was so close to reality that The Woman in the Moon was withdrawn from exhibition in Germany during World War II in the interest of national security.
It was the first space movie ever made that was based really consciously on real rocket science, which is one reason it looks so good.
5, 4, 3.
Across the ocean in America, the motion picture Destination Moon, based on a story by science fiction writer Robert Heinlein, was released in 1950. The film provided a remarkably realistic account of the first manned journey to the moon 19 years before the launch of astronaut Neil Armstrong and Apollo 11.
In Destination Moon, Robert A. Heinlein had a complete lunar scape. Nobody had ever set foot on the moon. And he took photos and he composed this set from a series of photos that had been taken. It was as if we were there.
Heinlein really did the world a favor. They wanted to turn it into a musical when they got to the moon, to find moon maidens there and have them dancing around and so on. And he put thumbs down on that, so we got a really serious film. It paved the way, I really think, for the space program.
Man on the Moon. The landing took the science fiction world by storm. This was indeed science fiction becoming science fact.
I had a piece of paper and a pen, and I had an audio recorder. And I wanted to record that magic moment. And I found myself saying, vindication.
Along with the moon, science fiction writers have always been fascinated with Mars, the fourth planet from the sun.
It's very easy to figure out why I got interested in space and things like that. The book was called The Exploration of Mars. And in there was a single painting by Chesley Bonestell. It was a realistic scene, and that's what really hooked me into space and rocketry and everything else.
Mars has been visited by human tourists for years. In science fiction stories, that is. One of the most popular is The Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury. He first imagined the Mars-scape in this passage.
Beyond the marble amphitheater lay little towns and villas. Pools of silver water stood motionless, and canals glittered from horizon to horizon.
Bradbury's vision of Mars is not exact, but scientists at NASA and the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California, have determined that Mars is the most likely habitat for life beyond Earth. Some readily admit that they are inspired and informed by science fiction.
I find for me to be effective, for example, in building an instrument to send to Mars, I have to think like a Martian. Now, I can read Bob Zubrin, I can read Johnson's point reference design for going to Mars. I learn a lot more by reading Kim Stanley Robinson and getting into the head of people that might live on Mars and what they'll see and do and experience. Thinking about and reading about people on Mars coping with that environment helps me get an intuitive feeling for it that is much better than all the equations I can write down. The important thing to remember is that when people go to Mars, they'll be there for 500 days before they could come back. So it's not like going to the moon and visiting for a couple of days and returning. It's a real pioneer opportunity to settle in and live on the planet before we return.
Once that feat is achieved, life on Mars can be added to the remarkable list of sci-fi prophecies. Not all of the marvels imagined by science fiction writers have come true, yet. Time travel, popularized in 1895 by H.G. Wells's The Time Machine, is still well beyond the reach of today's science.
The little hands upon the dial that registered my speed raced around faster and faster, and consequently my pace was over a year a minute.
Wells was doing something that nobody else did at that time, and the idea of time travel, we might have had it before. People would get hit on the head, or people would fall asleep and they would wake up somewhere else. But here he actually devised a machine and a theory behind how that machine would go from the present to the future. And this was simply unheard of.
If that machine can do what you say it can, destroy it, George, before it destroys you.
Time travel can never happen. Time is an arrow, folks. It only heads in one direction. You can't go back.
Yet there are some scientists with hopes of making Wells' vision of time travel a reality. Another science fiction invention that hasn't yet been achieved is faster-than-light travel.
Science fiction needs a way to travel to other planets and other stars. And faster-than-light travel is the only feasible way to accomplish that within the lifetimes of the characters involved. So it exists. It doesn't mean that it ever will.
Whether you call it quantum travel, hyperdrive, or warp speed, faster-than-light travel technology has allowed us to seek out new life and new civilizations in the world of sci-fi.
Typically, in any good story, you're allowed one gimme. One thing that, well, okay, we don't believe faster-than-light travel is possible, but you can have it for this story.
While time travel and faster-than-light speeds are firmly beyond today's technology, there is one fantastic vision on its way to becoming a reality. Cryonics, a bizarre marriage of science fact, fiction, and hope. Inspired by R.C.W. Ettinger's novel, The Prospect of Immortality in 1964, cryonics involves freezing dead bodies in liquid nitrogen and keeping them in storage. The goal? Resurrection, as Ettinger described.
Centuries may pass, but to him there will only be a moment of sleep without dreams. After awakening, he may already be again young and virile, having been rejuvenated while unconscious.
The people who are the scientists who work for Alcor and these cryonics foundations still credit this man as being their patron saint, the one that gave them the idea.
Cryonics is a partially realized science fiction vision. We know how to freeze the bodies, but we're not yet able to bring them back to life. But for now, cryonics is seen as a win-win situation.
On a risk-reward basis, there's nothing that can be said against it. Considering that you're already clinically dead when you're frozen, the risk is really not very significant. The cost is not very significant. The rewards are certainly immense.
We live in an amazing time, a time of incredible discoveries and astounding inventions. We see evidence of it everywhere, in technology, medicine, war, and our voyages to the stars. The rate of change is rapid. The old world is replaced by the new at a blinding pace. Science fiction is a creative way of getting a handle on these changes.
I think it's absolutely wonderful to be alive at this time when such a transition is taking place. And I think that that is the reason for the incredible richness of our fiction, because we're moving into an era that we can imagine, and yet no one really knows where it's going, except it's obvious to anyone that it's going to transform us. We're moving out into space. Everything is going to change.
every age has new wonders, and the speculations of one age become the reality of the next.
While no one knows exactly what the future will bring, some writers may be able to give us a glimpse of the worlds to come. We find that the line between science fiction and science fact becomes more and more blurred as we boldly go in search of history.